Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. I'm John Ackerman, and that's where I run out of the things that I usually get to say because I'm sitting on the wrong side of the table, and this is clearly not Brian Bales.
No, I am much better looking than Brian Bales.
Preach. This is my amazing wife, Brooke Ackerman, who co-leads our middle and high school ministry here at CFC. And if you've been tracking with us for the last few weeks, the Sunday series, we've been going through the book of Ruth. And we've been talking in particular about what it looks like to find ourselves in situations where we need God to come through for us. We just can't fix a situation ourselves. And in some cases, we've tried really hard to fix a situation ourselves, and that hasn't worked out well. And one of the things now, if you were with us this Sunday, invitation is always, watch the Sunday service, come check us out. This one's slightly different because this Sunday's service is what we like to call our indispensable Sunday. It's the Sundays where we talk about, our mission statement as a church is to disciple people to know Jesus as Lord, to be a spirit-directed church, discipling people to know Jesus as Lord. And the way that we are trying to live out that mission here in this place where God has placed us is to be indispensably integrated in the community around us. And so periodically we like to share the stories of what that's looked like as we are trying to become indispensably integrated in the community around us. And so that's what today's message was. That's hard to turn into a Faith Forward podcast because that's a story of celebration. Right? It's a story of what has happened. And so practical steps from what has happened would really just look like go be indispensably integrated into your community. And so at that point, we could turn off the podcast right there. Shortest podcast on record. But one of the other things that we wanted to do in this space is to expand the conversation, to include more voices, more perspectives, more stories of what it's looked like to live a life of faith with God, what it's looked like to put our faith into action. And so Brooke is here today as we continue where Brian and I left off last week of what it's looked like for us to wait on God, much like Ruth and Naomi were, to rescue them from things that they found themselves in the midst of and incapable of resolving on their own. And if you've watched the last couple of episodes, I've shared some stories of what that's looked like, not only in my life, but in our life. Yeah. And it seemed like what better thing to do than to bring the other half of the story in, and let's actually tell the whole story. Plus, Brooke's just wonderful.
Oh, well, thanks.
So if you've not met her, you should, because she's great. But as we look back at these last few weeks of us talking about this, again, we talked about not wasting our waiting, right? That when we have opportunities, and opportunities may feel like the wrong word, but when we have moments where we need God to show up and it just feels like he's not, what do we do in the midst of that? We've tried crying out, we've tried praying, maybe we've tried fasting, maybe we've tried, we've tried everything, and it just is not working. What do we do in the midst of the waiting? Rather than just going passive and shutting down and twiddling our thumbs until God shows up, how do we intentionally grow our relationship with him while we're waiting for the thing to happen? And so Brian and I had talked for several weeks about practical ways that we can not waste the waiting. And then we had talked about once God shows up, let's not fall back into old habits, right? Let's make sure that everything that we've learned and all the ways that we've grown become the new normal in our relationship with God. And then we talked about our own stories of waiting, the times where we've seen God come through and the times that we still find ourselves needing God to come through. And so, sweetie, I'd shared a little bit over the last couple of weeks about our most recent adventures, God inviting you to leave your career as a public school teacher, and God inviting us into this adventure of land in a farmhouse that we hadn't envisioned previously, and where we had just briefly touched on in the last episode, this adventure to maintain the hope and desire for children in a family. So as we sort of recap all of this and begin to dive into this week's episode, what are some initial thoughts that come up for you when you hear this idea of waiting on God to move, waiting with God?
Yeah. Well, when you said that, the farmhouse and land was not something that we had thought of, I feel like this was like a different kind of waiting for me, because that was always something that I actually really wanted. And I just sort of chalked it up to, well, that's probably never going to happen, so I'll just toss that aside. And so to have that almost just drop in our laps and have that rekindle a desire that had always been there, but I sort of dismissed for self-protection, so that I didn't hold out hope on something that seemed hopeless. That's a different kind of waiting. And so for that to be fulfilled, and yet we're still in the midst of waiting with the topic of land and house, and because it's not, I'm sure you've talked about how it's, at some point, have you talked about how it's still a work in progress? And
briefly,
the house that we bought is definitely a work in progress. John and his dad are doing all kinds of work to it. And so while we have that is something that has been fulfilled, it's still not where it will be at some point. And so we have the thing, and yet we're still waiting for several other things. I mean, we only have chickens and goats. And for me, that is not where we're stopping.
Sure.
So again, we have it, yet they're still waiting for the full picture of what this will be someday.
Yeah.
So that's a different kind of waiting. So while that has been fulfilled, there are still things associated with that fulfillment that are still in progress and waiting. And so that's been a really interesting experience. That was one of those, like, I don't want to say wake up call, but it was like, one of those moments of realization of, even when you get the thing that you've been waiting for, there's always something else that's tied to it, or there's the next thing that you're waiting for. And so you can't hang all of your hopes on the thing, because that's not really the point of fulfillment.
Right. Yeah, I really like that you created sort of in the waiting, God will often bring up internally the reasons why we're waiting, and refine those and hone those and bring those to light. And so, like you were talking about, that desire for land and a farmhouse had been in there since your earliest childhood.
Oh, yeah.
And yet along the way, they'd been discarded, and they'd been minimized, and in some cases never totally forgotten, but at least pushed so far to the side as to feel like, I'm not actually waiting for this anymore.
Right. Yes.
Because it's hard to wait.
Right. Yeah, it was easier to say, well, I don't really want that, or it's never really going to happen, so I'll just put that over here in this corner, than it was to allow myself to continue to hope for something that seemed near impossible.
Yeah. So just when you thought we were done with practical tips on waiting, here's another gem, right? Sometimes in the waiting, what God is after is the desires of our heart that He's placed there that we've forgotten or suppressed, because waiting's hard. And sometimes in the waiting, what He's doing is inviting us to hope and to dream and to desire again. And so it's not just about the thing, but it's the cultivation of the heart that then is well prepared to receive the thing when it arrives.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a lesson that we've been learning over these years as well, of learning to not just wait well by enduring it, but to hope well and desire well while we're waiting.
Yeah. Yeah, and even at the beginning of this calendar year, we sit down and we ask God for a word or a thought for us, like individually or together, for the year. And the word that He gave me this year was dream. And I had a slightly hard time with that at first, because I thought, well, how is that really all that different from hoping? And the more God and I had conversations about that, the more He was inviting me into actually taking action and dreaming with Him for things that are not yet, but hopefully for me are on the horizon at some point. And so dreaming also in this idea of waiting for whatever the thing is that we're waiting for was quite a disruptive thought for me, because hoping sort of for me became a little passive, and I don't like that it became passive, but especially with the idea of like land and farm and animals and house and all of that, like to actively engage my heart again with things that I'm wanting. that was difficult. That was a step to a little more action than I was prepared for.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, as you mentioned, God's invitation to you to dream. I hadn't completely forgotten, but I'd kind of forgotten until this moment that the word that it felt like I got for this year was desire. Mm-hmm. And so just how well those two matched where we are together in our waiting. Yeah. But just that encouragement to, again, don't just wait passively. Yeah. But to wait with anticipation, with hopefulness, with an engaged heart.
Mm-hmm. And with expectation that if God has promised, or if there is something that's truly a heart's desire that he has put in you, then he will come through. It's not just I hope. Right. Maybe. It's, no, hope with intention. Yeah. Dream and desire with intention, because God will come through. Yeah. Even if it's not the way you want or when you want.
Right. The other thing I really liked that you brought up was that waiting often begets waiting, which begets waiting depending on how we're focused on it. Right. And
it can be a hopeful and joyful waiting, or it can be a seriously now more waiting. And so
Yeah. But again, just when you thought we were out of practical tips for waiting, it's, I think, another one of the things that God's after so often in the waiting is to help us refocus our attention, not so much on what we're waiting for, but who we're waiting with, if you want to say it that way. Because you're right, there's always going to be a next thing that we're waiting for if we're focused on the completion or the accumulation of the thing.
Yeah, there's always a next thing.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so there again, and because that doesn't then mean you go back on everything that we just said about desire and hope and anticipation and expectation to just squash all that because you're just endlessly waiting right? But it's the recognition that as you're hoping and desiring in the midst of your waiting, that there's the hope and desire and the expectation and the anticipation for the thing that you're waiting for is here. And the hope and the desire and the expectation and the anticipation of being with God. Yes. In the midst of whatever is next is here. It's not the diminishment of this to the point where it doesn't matter at all. Right. But it's maintaining sort of that proper relationship between the two. And the only way you get better at that is to do it.
Yeah, you have to engage. And that was one of the things that when God told me my word was dream, is that he told me to dream with him. Because he said, if I put my hopes and dreams and desires in his hands, then he can do more than you can imagine. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I hold on to them and try to manufacture these things and come up with them on my own, you can do it to some extent, but it's nowhere near the same thing as engaging in conversation with him and partnership and seeing how you can do this together. And I don't want to throw out the, just put it all in God's hands and it'll be fine. Because yes, that is true, but that gets thrown around to people who are waiting way too often, and it doesn't help, and it can almost be really hurtful. But when God said it to me, we're doing this together, let me show you how we can do this together. And that was entirely different than, let me just hope that God does what I want. That's not the same thing as you and God in it together and learning along the way what it means to really be connected to him in the waiting.
Yeah. This now makes me think of two different directions we can go at the same time. Because we finished the last episode, Brian and I were talking about the places in our life that we're still waiting. Mm-hmm. And I'd only briefly mentioned, and I've briefly mentioned it in other places as well, that Brooke and I have had the desire for children for about a decade now. And that desire has gone unfulfilled as of today.
Yep, as far as I know.
As far as we know. And the difficulty of continuing to wait, right? And we saw that in this story of Ruth, that, as Naomi was enduring what seemed like guaranteed destruction, right? That there was in some level, in whatever degree, God might show up. Right. God will probably, hopefully show up, fingers crossed.
Right, it's that kind of hope.
Right. But at the same time, I don't really know. Yeah. And so we've definitely walked that road as well and are continuing to walk it of God, are you showing up? You're showing up, right? You're coming. Are you coming? Are you even there, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it might be helpful to talk a little bit more about what that experience of continuing to be in the waiting is like, because I think oftentimes, without meaning to, when we tell the stories of God coming through, it's not helpful for the people for whom God hasn't yet come through.
Yeah.
Right? When other people's stories have a bow on it and ours don't, it can sort of feel like we've gotten left out, or we've been forgotten, or whatever the case is. And so the other thing I think it might be really helpful to do at this point is for us to share, again, very practically, how do you engage with people that are in the midst of their waiting? Like how can you be loving and supportive and encouraging without being able to resolve their waiting for them in a way that is actually helpful? So any place you want to take either of those?
Yeah. So, okay, I don't want to give a false impression of the way that I have waited for children specifically, because at this point, I could make it sound like it's been, it's been difficult, but it's not been that bad. Whereas if you think of any emotion, any thought, anything that was difficult for you in your particular waiting, I've definitely felt it, said it, done it. There are times that I was so angry in the waiting that I didn't know if God and I were still okay. I was kind of waiting for him to be like, well, you went way too far with what you just said to me, or your thought, or the way that you were behaving, that was like a deal breaker, which we know that's not how God operates. But I'm just making sure that we get the spectrum of the emotional roller coaster that I have been on for 10 years. And I definitely went through the phase, and at different times. It wasn't just like in this chunk of time. It popped up here and there of, okay, well, if I do these things, if I say these prayers, if I, get all the, follow the recipe, then, and that's not necessarily how that works either. and it took me longer than I would like to admit to realize that it wasn't about the thing. It was about my connection and relationship with God, and that even though there were times in the waiting that felt really difficult, and to the point where I would say to John all the time, it feels like God's just being mean, which again, I know that that's not true, but it felt really true. Like I had to just stay in it with him in the really tough parts, in the days that were just okay, where at least I wasn't a weepy mess. Mm-hmm. And in the days that actually felt hopeful and things felt true and real and like there was something on the horizon, I just had to stick it out with him, whatever came, because if he is who he says he is, then whatever he's asking me to do, even wait 10 plus years for children, then there has to be something there. He has to be revealing more of something in me that I'm not necessarily aware of, or, kind of like sanding off the rough edges, or there had to be purpose in it, because he's not going to ask me to wait for something that is such a heart's desire for no reason at all. And so there has to be a reason for me to stick with him in this. And I don't like that it was that this is my journey, and I don't like that it was this difficult, but I would never trade the connection and the relationship that I have with God that has come out of that. And I don't know if it could have come under any other kinds of circumstances, because to go through this long of a waiting period for something that is such a deep desire that he has given me, and to come out on the other side, even though that hasn't been fulfilled yet for us, and to still be, to still want a connection with him, and to still, seek that and enjoy it, and that to also be a desire that I don't know how else that could have happened, except that, that's like God's that big and he's that good to us and that loving, because it doesn't make sense otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a difference between walking through the wilderness and wondering where God is and walking through the wilderness with God.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
And you see the way that the Israelites, even as they still fell back into the, God, why wouldn't you just let us go back to Egypt? Yep. At least there we had food, right? There was still at the same time this recognition of, you were the God that parted the Red Sea when disaster seemed imminent. You were the God that fed us in the wilderness with manna from heaven when starvation seemed imminent. You were the God that gave us water to drink from a rock when death seemed imminent. We have seen you in places of hardship that have drastically reframed the way that we would know you if we had always been in the land of plenty.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so you're right. There's something, good isn't the right word.
Yeah.
But it's more just the lacking of language. There's something good that comes from walking with God through the wilderness.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that you have to experience something very difficult to feel close to God. Like, I don't want to, we don't have to go all the way down. Like, unless you've truly suffered, you can't be close to God, because that's not true either. But it's just like just like any other relationship, when you go through something difficult, it bonds you in a different way than always having celebrations, always the good times. Like, when you go through a difficult situation with a friend or a spouse or a family member, or it connects you in a way that other ways don't.
Right. And we've talked about this before on this platform too. There's really no need for false comparison, right? There's no need to hear our story and go, well, man, compared to that, you guys have no idea what suffering is. Do you know what I've lived through?
Yeah.
Right? Because that's not actually helpful to anybody, nor is it helpful to go the other direction and go, well, I've got nothing to complain about because I haven't had to endure that. Yes. Comparing your story to somebody else's as a way to measure the acceptability of your pain or your joy is just not helpful.
No.
And so we all, I think it's probably fair to say, all have endured waiting in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's the waiting for a relationship or waiting for the restoration of a relationship, right? Whether it's waiting for children or waiting for the return of a prodigal child or a rebellious child, right? Whether it's the waiting for meaningful work and gainful employment, or it's the waiting for work and gainful employment to become meaningful, right? Whether it's the home you desired or the family dynamic that you've always, yearned for, like whatever, like we've waited. We all have. And so really one of the most helpful things is to see our waiting on God as a unifying thing rather than a divisive thing. And not in a way that then seeks to equally compare stories as, that time that I had to wait 2 weeks before I got the job that I wanted is equal to 10 years of waiting for the job, right? But there's also no need to minimize your own pain and suffering. And so this may be a helpful time to switch to, like, how do you love people well in the midst of their waiting when it feels like things are going pretty well for you? Or at least if you were going to falsely compare, it feels like things are going way better for you.
Yeah. And one of the things that's been really helpful to me is to have friends who just sit there in the waiting with us, and who from time to time try to offer helpful suggestions. And that's just, I think that's just hardwired in all of us. We don't want to see someone that we love going through a difficult thing, but far more helpful than anything that anyone has ever said are the people who've just been there and said, as long as you are in this, I am in this with you.
Yeah.
And that, not having things to say to us often has been far more helpful than the suggestions. And again, I think remembering that we are all visitors to somebody else's waiting, even if it's something similar. Even if it's something similar, your situation is not the same as somebody else's. Even if friends of ours who are also waiting for children, it's still not exactly the same, because we are individual people. We have our own relationship with each other. We have our own relationship with God. And so even knowing that when it's similar, you are still a visitor to their waiting and their difficulty and their pain, that's been really very helpful.
Yeah, much like Job's friends, right? The best job they did
Was sit there
and be quiet.
Yes.
And I know sometimes because we're uncomfortable when other people are uncomfortable. And like you said, there's something in us that wants to bring comfort, that wants to bring encouragement. And this isn't to say there's never a time for that. Don't do that ever, right? But there's sort of, one of the ways that we can grow in someone else's waiting is being able to wait with them rather than needing their waiting to hurry up.
So that you feel better.
So that I feel better that they're not waiting.
Yes.
Right? Being willing to be uncomfortable with them in their discomfort can be a really helpful thing because, again, if you've experienced loss, if you've experienced grief and heartache, if you've experienced prolonged waiting, you know that oftentimes it feels like people want you to just hurry up. They want you to get over it.
Yeah.
Right? And so one of the most loving, helpful things that we can do when we're with someone who's waiting or grieving or hurting is to not ask them to hurry up and get over it.
Yeah. And like you said, that doesn't mean don't ever say anything. You don't have to quite literally be silent, but it's more of the kind of take a minute to examine, why am I wanting to say this thing? Is it because I'm uncomfortable with your waiting and I just want to feel better?
Yeah.
Or is it, this feels like something that would be really helpful or that would be really encouraging. And then, of course, share kind words or encouraging words or something that was helpful to you in your own waiting. It's all just intention matters so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, one of the other things that, and you've probably said this, I know we've said this, is it okay if I ask you about, right? I don't want to bring it up because the thought we don't finish is because you may not actually be thinking about it right now. And I don't want to make you sad because you've been sad for a long time and that makes me uncomfortable and it makes me sad for you, right? For those that are hurting and grieving and waiting and aching, you know that it's never far from your mind. And so when people are willing to sit with you in the midst of your hurting and grieving and aching and waiting, that's worth so much. And they won't have just suddenly brought it back to mind for you. We were sitting there and all was right with the world. And then they say, hey, how are you doing? And you're like, well, I was fine until you said, right? That's just not how that works. We're not quick to forget those types of deep aches and hurts. And so being willing, when you know that people are hurting, to address it.
Yeah. Acknowledge it, engage with them, and it doesn't have to be, talk through all of the painful details. It can. A really good friend of mine, when she was going through a very difficult situation, she said that when people would ask, "How are you?" that was hard because obviously I'm not doing well. Whereas saying, "You were on my mind today," or "I thought of you today," that was just a slight change in the verbiage, and it was, I'm not alone, but I don't have to explain, I don't have to justify, I don't have to go through all of the emotional pain that I'm in and share it with somebody. It was just, thank you that you thought of me, and that's very meaningful and helpful.
Yeah. So again, we didn't actually script out most of this. We thought it was just going to be a conversation about stories of waiting, and it turns out there was some undiscovered opportunities for helpful ways to wait, not only as we ourselves are waiting, but as we're waiting with others. So, sweetie, thank you for sharing in this conversation.
Sure. Do you call Brian sweetie when he's here?
You're going to have to go back and watch the other videos to get the answer to that question.
I've seen some, but I don't know. Maybe there were a few that I missed that, little terms of endearment came out.
No, only you. So for all of you, thank you for being part of this platform. Thank you for wanting to continue to take your faith forward in practical ways. Thank you for being willing, especially in this most recent topic, of engaging in prolonged conversations about the uncomfortableness of waiting and how we can stay close to God and how we can stay close to each other in the midst of that. So on behalf of my lovely wife, Brooke, I'm still John, sitting on the wrong side of the table. Grateful for you being a part of this. And as always, if you have questions or comments or stories of your own that you want to share, you can email us at faithforward@cfcwire.org. And we're even happy to pass things along to Brooke as well if you have questions for her. I know where she lives. So again, thank you all for being a part of this community of people that are trying to grow closer to God day by day. And we'll see you next time.